Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to an amazing Saturday session, inshallah. Thank you for staying with us and reading with us. Thank you for your prayers. It was a hard day today, and we did have to start a little late because a sheikh is still struggling with pain. But thank you everyone who has been praying and wishing him strength and healing. Inshallah, things will get easier each time I pray. I just wanted to share a really lovely email that I've received recently. These are, again, I love sharing these messages because they give you a pulse on how people are responding to the halaqas, and for us, they're just so touching and moving, and I feel like it's important, since we recognize that we're sort of a relatively small group at times, to feel connected to a community that I think appreciates the work that we're doing, even though sometimes you see other Muslim people or leaders have a lot more followers, and we get a lot of questions like, why is it that we only have a small number of subscribers? But I really believe that the power of the message is so much more important than the numbers, and inshallah I always believe that God will send people when they are ready at the right time, because it's not a message that what we do here is pretty advanced. It requires I think a certain type of person who is ready to spend some time thinking about their relationship with God, who are looking for something more than what you find on social media, which is just a very superficial comment sometimes, or an identity or a persona. It's usually for people who are looking for something deeper, and I think that's something that we offer here. So this was a really beautiful message. Assalamu alaikum. I would like to introduce myself. I was born and live in Belgium. I've been following your website and Instagram for quite some time, and have seen that you do an English commentary of verses for quite some time too. I have been putting off watching your videos for quite some time. I wish I did not, but I did. I have just finished the first surah, Al-Hadid, for 5 hours straight and couldn't stop. I was so eager to learn more and more about your findings, your research, and the values of Islam and what the Quran teaches us. I'm a born believer and have lost my way several times now. I have been blessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who keeps helping me find my way back to Islam. I have always felt out of sync with a lot of Muslims, not liking what they say, yet I was always able to fall back on what for me summed up my meaning of what was my meaning of Islam through the 5 pillars of Islam, but also what I saw my mother do, which was always being kind and patient under any circumstance. I have always felt a disconnect when I read the Quran, which I realized was most likely me not putting my full heart in it. I have approached the Quran for far too long as a rational being, or maybe it's my Orientalist education and life which had indoctrinated me into believing what most of the West thinks about Islam, or by just hiding my thorough self from the outside world. However, I have always felt a true connection with God, despite not liking what a lot of my surrounding Muslims said about Islam, or what Western society said about Islam. Yet despite firmly believing in Allah and Islam, I've lacked a deep connection with the Quran when reading it. Anyway, all this to say that I have been touched and so moved by your work. I often get frustrated because I question everything. Quite a bit annoying, at least that's what my mom tells me, because every time I read something about Islam or in the Quran, I question it, but never felt that my questions have been answered, or didn't comprehend that if God was so merciful, why does this not reflect in most Muslim countries, etc. Anyway, again, I'm talking too much, sorry for that. When I followed your teachings in Surah Al-Hadid, I felt like every time I had a question, the professor was there to answer them. I love what you are doing, and I am hoping you'll be able to teach your findings with students, inshallah. Again, I'm truly happy I started this journey to understand the true meaning of the Quran. I'm excited to follow all of your commentary, and inshallah we'll hope to meet you in person. May Allah bless and protect you and everything who is working so hard to make this project possible. So, alhamdulillah, it's such a beautiful message, and I wanted to comment about a couple of things because I think it's a very common experience. And certainly, we do post a lot of quotes on Instagram, and try and sort of increase our awareness for for Muslims that are out there, because it's a challenge, I think, these days to figure out what is the best way to reach this particular audience. And hopefully over time, people will get interested enough and jump into a 5 or 6 hour halaqah, which is extremely daunting. But I think, alhamdulillah, that this person, took the jump and found it so valuable. And alhamdulillah, we've had other people that have, written to us about that. And so I've gotten some messages recently by people who have found us not that long ago. And so I wanted to just say a couple of things, because it is daunting when you see this entire, library of content, all the YouTube videos, huge websites with stuff. It's like you start feeling like, oh my gosh, where do I start? What do I do? There's so much to do. And it's really important not to feel overwhelmed. And I recall, like, when I was starting this journey and trying to find Islam, I think what would have been really valuable for me, I think what I want to say is we've covered now so much of the Quran, and inshallah, if you're just finding us, you'll find your way, and, take your time, and, don't feel overwhelmed. But, there were a few heuristics or shortcuts or things that I think are valuable to just keep in mind. And, one is, and this is all stuff that you can come back and find the textual support for. Every Muslim here has dealt with Muslims that are frustrating, and people who are not, either rational or feel that they're too ritualistic. But I think that what we're trying to emphasize here is the ethical message. And, in any circumstance, the question for an individual is, what is the most ethical way, number one, of approaching anything in life? And secondly, then, what is the most beautiful way? Because, we've learned certainly in Surah Al-Abasa, you can be good, you can be kind, but you want to be good in the most beautiful way. And then, thirdly, since we know that God sees everything that you do and knows what's in your heart, whatever action you take, what do you think would make God the most proud? Assuming that you think of God as a loving God that wants to see you grow and wants to see you be your best self. And I think these are really important, simple questions that any human being can ask about, how to be a good Muslim. We've learned in the last surah, like the basics in terms of ritual, in terms of trying to develop yourself. But, taking a step back, it's, when I was starting out on this journey, one of the big questions that I had was, how do I really make sense of, like, being Muslim versus being a part of humanity, and connecting with my dear friends who are not Muslim and who have no chance of ever becoming Muslim. And to this day, some of the most beautiful people that I know are not Muslim and may never be Muslim. But I look at them and I think, I love my friends that I've, kept as friends over the years, because they are the most kind, the most rational, the most generous, the most giving, in ways that are really inspirational for any human being. And when you try to think about what it means to be a good Muslim, like here we spend a lot of time kind of dreaming about, what are the things that we want to achieve through this work? How do we want to touch people? How do we want to touch Muslims? Personally, I think about, how do I want to empower my fellow Muslims, to love this message and to love God and to love, being proud to be Muslim. And I often think about, I wish that Muslims will take from what we do here and just feel like they can be the best of humanity, like my friends who are not Muslim, like the ones that are super rational, super kind, super generous, and all of that, and understand that that is exactly what God expects us to be as Muslims, and that we should be on the forefront of that example. And it's disappointing when you find Muslims that frustrate you because they're not living up to those standards. And I think sometimes, we talk a lot about, pietistic affectations, like people when they act a certain way or look a certain way because they think that's what Muslims are supposed to do. But one of the things I think we're trying to reclaim here is something authentic and something that is genuinely beautiful and that arises from a common humanity that we all share. Something that other people, whether they're Muslim or not, can recognize and feel in their hearts. And, so when I think of these new Muslims who are just discovering us and wondering, how do I proceed? Where do I go? What is it that I'm supposed to take away from here? I think it's something very intuitive, something very basic, something that you will find emphasized in every single halaqah that we've done, every single khutbah, every single thing is just to be on the cutting edge of what is the most beautiful, the most rational, the most kind, the most generous, the most, normal, and not to be held back by what you perceive Muslims are supposed to look like, sound like, feel like. I mean, we're kind of going against the tide with what we're doing here. We get a lot of messages from people about, how could it be that a woman is speaking to you without wearing a scarf? How could it be that you have a dog in your midst? How could it be that, the sheikh is drinking out of his left hand? I mean, it's like crazy, stupid stuff. And that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to replace with something that is actually authentic and meaningful. And that's something that I truly believe God actually cares about. We have everything within our hearts and our minds to be the best and to be, what we can make God proud to say, okay, that's someone I love. That's someone that I hold dear in my eye, as we've learned about. And just to let that beauty guide you, even, and all the knowledge that you pick up here through the halakas will only emphasize that very beautiful fundamental thing that every human being will recognize, Muslim or not. And that's enough. And to start with that and to build on that, and just to try and find your way, ask God to guide you, and to listen to and learn as much as you can. But ultimately, just to rely on that part of your soul that's extremely beautiful, that can touch other human beings. So that's really all I wanted to share for people starting the journey. And may Allah always guide you, and may Allah help us and bless Shaykh and help us to continue this journey on the Quran. And all of this knowledge will just help to sort of make all of us stronger and better human beings. So, inshallah. Thank you. Looking forward to another amazing halaqah, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه واتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم يا علي يا عظيم اللهم لا تكلفنا إلا وسعنا اللهم لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا اللهم لا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا اللهم لا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Inshallah, today we'll deal with Surah Yunus. Surah Yunus is a bit of a daunting surah, and it's one of these surah that the main challenge for me is a pedagogical challenge, is how to present it, because it is it is a very layered surah, and inshallah, as I think you'll come to see and understand, that I even dare say that if you understand, it's one of these surah that if you understand Surah Yunus and you internalize it, and if you truly internalize it, you will be a transformed human being. It is just inevitable. And if you're not transformed, that means you just haven't internalized it. Intellectual understanding is one thing, but not everything that passes through our intellect affects our consciousness, leave alone our subconsciousness. There are a lot of things that we process through the intellect, but our consciousness is something else. And if, as is the main challenge with the Quran, is that it it is not processed, that you don't process the Quran simply on your tongue, and you don't process the Quran simply through your intellect, but that you process the Quran through your heart, and that it in fact then has a direct bearing on your consciousness and the way that you see the world, and the way that you see the self, and the way that you see others, and the way that you understand reality, and you understand what is beyond reality. All of that is raised in various ways through the discourse of Surah Yunus. And Surah Yunus occupies a rather interesting place because there are reports that claim that Surah Yunus is revealed pre-Isra, before the Isra and Mi'raj. And most, in my opinion, these reports are most certainly wrong. In my opinion, there is very little chance that Surah Yunus was in fact revealed before the Isra. Indeed, the much more likely scenario, and where the evidence points out, is that Surah Yunus is the first surah to be revealed right after the Isra. And this turns out to be quite important. And it's not just quite important because of Surah Yunus itself. And pay attention to this point, because I've not read it anywhere, I've not seen it anywhere, but you had the Isra, which we've talked about plenty of times, and we've dealt with Surah Al-Isra itself. And we know that the Isra was a turning point. It was a turning point because many of those who had converted to Islam apostated after the Isra. So it was a major test, a test that many failed. But we also know that after the Isra and Mi'raj, the persecution of Muslims escalated at a very alarming speed. And Muslims confronted some of the toughest periods in the history of the Islamic da'wah, the Islamic message. So it is quite significant what Allah chooses to tell us right after this major test, this major trial of faith, the trial of Al-Isra al-Mi'raj. And as I said, the more credible reports, in my opinion, is that the first revelation indeed is Surah Yunus, right after the Isra. But then, right after the Surah Yunus, we have Surah Hud and Surah Yusuf. So we get these consecutive revelations: Yunus, Hud, Yusuf. And then after Yusuf, we'll get Surah Al-Hijr. And after Al-Hijr is Al-An'am, which we've dealt with Al-Hijr, but we haven't dealt with Al-An'am. Surah Yunus, Al-Hud, Surah Yunus, Hud, and Yusuf, in many ways are a continuing theme, and it will take us some time before we are able to uncover what the theme is, because obviously, you know, we're talking about 3 long surah. But there is a thematic continuity between Yunus, Hud, and Yusuf, and not only that, but I'll even go a step beyond this and say that those who understand the sequence of revelation between Yunus, Hud, and Yusuf, and what is being communicated and how it's being communicated, and those who then understand what will take place in Islamic history later on, you would have to be a pretty obstinate, pig-headed human being not to believe. In this package, Isra, Yunus, Hud, and Yusuf is, it is just, you know, we have often the Quran talk about how the polytheists demanded a miracle from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but in this sequence of revelations is a miracle. And if you come to understand these surahs, you see it very clearly that it's a miracle, and it is beyond what human beings can do, because part of it involves actually knowledge of what will transpire in the future and how things will resolve, but you have to understand the thematic unity between these surah, and you have to understand how each surah sort of hands the baton to the next surah until you get the message communicated by Surah Yusuf, and then we get a number of surah that are a surah that set the framework for the social ethics of the new society in Medina. Okay, so there's going to be a great deal of, or a large number of issues that we will deal with in Surah Yunus, and if you really want to get the full message, don't miss any of these Yunus, Hud, Yusuf. I don't know when Allah wants us to cover Hud and Yusuf, but I hope it's soon, because I think that, personally, I think that the message is communicated by it. And inshallah, once we get through this journey, I'll go back and I'll remind you of the thematic unity and the connections between these surah. Okay, so Surah Yunus is the first among the 6 surah in the Quran that begin with Alif Lam Ra. And we've talked about Alif Lam Ra before, and there's no point in repeating what we've said. But as I've noted before, that the the surah that start with Alif Lam Ra seem to represent, it's as if they're coded for what in law you would call the constitutional center of the Quranic text. You notice that the Alif Lam Ra surah define, not in a legal sense, but in a moral and ethical and theological sense, the constitutional center of the Quran itself and the heart and pulse of the Quranic revelation and the Quranic message. And the other thing that is striking about Surah Yunus is that Surah Yunus takes us on a journey that for good 2/3 of the surah doesn't mention prophets. But then towards the end of the surah, you have a mention of the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, the prophets Musa and Harun, Musa and his brother alayhum salam, and the Prophet Yunus. And that's rather noteworthy, because whenever you see this in the Quran, then immediately you should reflect on, well, why these prophets? Why Nuh? Why Musa and Harun? And why Yunus? And especially that we know that Surah Hud will cover the same prophets minus Yunus, but from a very different perspective and a very different angle. Inshallah, as we'll see in due time. So that is something that should give us pause and should make us want to understand, well, why the structure of the surah is as it is. And what moral normative point is the surah communicating to its audience? Okay. So Surah Yunus starts out Alif Lam Ra Tilka Ayatul Kitab al-Hakim. Like all the Alif Lam Ra surah, Alif Lam Ra is followed immediately with a statement about the revelation itself. And the revelation, the very first ayah, it's like a code. It's alerting you that, yeah, this is the book of Revelation, that's obvious, but there is a point of wisdom. And when I find the Quran alerting me to the issue of wisdom, I know then I must understand the point of wisdom that Allah is inviting me to reflect on, or the points of wisdom. And it starts out in a fairly straightforward fashion, أكان للناس عجبا أن أوحينا إلى رجل منهم أن انذر الناس وبشر الذين آمنوا أن له قدم صدق عند ربهم قال الكافرون إن هذا لساحر مبين. And we are told, this is verse 2, we are told in the tradition that the occasion for revelation is that the kuffar of Mecca used to say, couldn't God have found someone other than an orphan to send as a prophet? Because as you probably could guess, it was considered a deficiency in social status to be an orphan. Although the Prophet ﷺ was from an honorable family, but the fact that he was an orphan meant that he was not among the wealthy, he was not among the powerful. You know, this in the social mores of the day was something considered problematic, and then they would say, well, you know, if God really wanted to send a prophet, couldn't God send someone other than an orphan? And couldn't God have chosen one of the richer families of Mecca? The only thing I want to say is about this is that although so many of the traditional tafsir tell you that this is an occasion for revelation, I don't doubt that this was one of the criticisms that the Meccans leveled against the Prophet ﷺ, and that this was an ongoing issue because it's raised in the Quran many times in different contexts. But I don't believe that this was an actual occasion for revelation. I mean, the problem with the expression occasion for revelation is that a lot of Muslims understand it as an event, the event that triggered the revelation, as if but for this event you wouldn't have gotten this surah at this time. And I think that's largely a fallacy, especially, and I underscore this so that later on, because that will become a question I'm sure that one of you will ask later on, especially with Meccan surah, and the Meccan surah that are these surah that can be counted as Kitab, the Meccan surah or the surah in the Quran, whether Meccan or otherwise, that set the constitutional normative order for what Islam is and what the Islamic message is. When Surah Yunus starts out by saying just using again the study Quran and its translation, you know, why is it that people are so surprised? Why do they marvel at the fact that we chose a human being, one of them, to be the messenger? There is a synchronicity and a correlation between that and the criticism that the Meccans made about the Prophet ﷺ being an orphan, but I don't think that was the occasion for revelation in terms of the trigger event, as is often stated. Now, so we've encountered the Quranic insistence that Allah, in order to communicate with rational human beings, Allah sends a rational human being to communicate with rational human beings. We've encountered this before. We've encountered the Quran saying, indeed, that if there were angels walking on the face of the earth, then Allah would send an angel as a prophet. But that Allah sends with a prophet who is like those who are receiving the message. But here, the first part, and أنذر الناس وبشر الذين آمنوا. We've encountered this before. Inzar is warn, and bashir, give good news. So we've encountered this as well before. And that all the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are both warners and deliverers of good news. Incidentally, in refabricated Protestant Christianity, where in the old Catholicism, medieval Catholicism, there was such a heavy emphasis on the warning part and a de-emphasis on the good news part, that post-Reformation, and especially with evangelical Christianity, the balance tipped to the other way, to an extreme. So in that prefabricated or refabricated Christianity, the emphasis became on the good news part, so much so that the inzar part, the warning part, was sort of de-emphasized. So much so that I after a long journey, I have become convinced that very few Christians have actually read the Bible cover to cover. I am willing to bet, if someone did an empirical study, that they will discover that what most Christians know about the Bible is whatever selections and passages are chosen for them by whatever church they belong to. Because I found, even as a Muslim, ignorance of the actual text of the Bible shockingly widespread. It's just, Christians have no idea what their Bible says, whether Old Testament or New Testament. You are more, even the Islamophobes, you discover that they've actually tried to read some form of Quran from cover to cover, but they don't seem to have bothered to read the Bible from cover to cover. It's very odd, very strange. But anyway, so, but it's sort of an interesting point about the development of religion. And something that the Quran itself, by the way, warns us about, is that when human beings co-opt the divine message and reconstruct it in order to project human psychological needs onto the divine writ, and then either turn the divine message into basically just inzar, a set of warnings, or into just good news, rather than the balance, which is core to the divine message. Time and again, as the Quran, as we said before, the Quran never mentions hellfire without mentioning Jannah, and never mentions Jannah without mentioning hellfire. It is that mizan, that balance, that is core to what Islam is, and in fact, Islam in the sense of the primordial message of Islam, the original Islam of Judaism, the original Islam of Christianity, the original Islam before human beings, start messing around with it. Okay, But here, this expression that we just want to pause with for a bit, أَنَّ لَهُمْ قَدَمَ صِدْقٍ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ. The study Quran translates this that they have a station of sincerity with their Lord. قدم صدق, it's a very, very literal translation to say a station of sincerity with their Lord. But it is also a very inadequate translation. قدم صدق عند ربهم. Now, remember, this again comes right after the Isra. And people after the Isra, as we said, many are, they're troubled by the claim that the Prophet ﷺ went beyond the laws of physical nature and traveled to Jerusalem, etc. But it is one of the most profound Quranic expressions that whether the message that you are receiving is one of inzar, one of the warning, or one of good news, the one of tabshir. By the way, it just occurred to me. Do you know in Arabic the word for proselytizing or in evangelism, in the Arabic word for Christian evangelism is tabshir, which is the same word as bushra. Why? Because evangelists always claim to bring good news, but it is the same word. And the word actually goes back to Aramaic, so it's not even, but because, I mean, yeah, it just, ignorance is an awful thing when you find, you know, it's just shocking how many people just have no clue, and they think they're receiving something eye-opening. But anyway, so whether you are receiving the warning or the good news, the bushra, the tabshir, qadam as-sidq is a remarkable expression connoting that it is in the balance between these two is the sure platform of truth. That it is, it is truly, it's very difficult to think of a more profound or eloquent way or a more succinct way of telling you that it is neither by good news alone, nor by inzar alone, by fear alone, that you can attain this solid foundation with your Lord. But it is by understanding precisely the equilibrium between them, the true nature of the relationship between them. Put differently, it is as if your Lord is telling you, you know, if you're just going to focus on the tabshir, on the bushra, on the good news, you're going to go astray. And if you just focus on the fear element, on hellfire and all the punishment, you're going to go astray. But this is by understanding and by connotation, by understanding what will unfold in Surah Yunus, if not in all the Quran, but definitely in Surah Yunus. And this is why some commentators, when they said, تِلْكَ آيَاتُ الْكِتَابِ الْحَكِيمِ, they said this is referring to Surah Yunus specifically. And other commentators said, well, why say it's just referring to Surah Yunus? It's just referring to the entire Quran. Those who said it's referring to Surah Yunus, what they meant by it is that Allah is alerting you to the importance of Surah Yunus itself in achieving this qadam sidq, this position of truthfulness and honesty with your Lord, so that you, in approaching your faith, you are a balanced human being, not lopsided, not skewed. And of course, as we've encountered many times before, is that when you are intent on denying something, and as we will see in a second how the Quran elaborates upon this, but that you come up with anything to satisfy your ego in its insistence on statism, meaning its insistence on the principle of no change. I am comfortable in what I'm doing. I am being challenged. I don't want to engage the normative call, because the normative call can make me change, and I don't want to. So I can dismissively say, well, this is a bunch of hocus pocus, this is a bunch of mythology, this is a bunch of magic, this is a bunch of sorcery, this is a bunch of... And as the Quran will say in a second, that these claims are not made because after any serious engagement with the arguments of the Quran, but are knee-jerk reactions to maintain the status quo, whatever it is. Okay. But Allah, as we've seen before many times, will repeatedly, when Allah takes you back to this issue of balance, this qadam sidq, this literally position of being solidly stable with your Lord. And we'll see how Surah Yunus develops this, by the way. But this position of being on solid grounds, if I wanted to put it idiomatically, it's say like on solid foundations with your Lord. If the Quran wants, as Allah elaborates upon this point, then Allah brings you back always to what the Quran always brings you back to. And that's the created Quran. The heart and core of everything is you cannot understand the written Quran unless you also internalize the created Quran. I know that for modern Muslims, this has become very alien talk to them. But if only you knew your tradition. If only you knew your tradition. The created Quran is necessary element or is a necessary, I would even say, it's a necessary epistemology, if you want to use fancy words, for the written Quran. And in the created Quran, that Allah, and as we talked about before, the concept of 6 days, that they're not days in the sense of but 6 periods, because while in the Latinized Bible, as you know, Jesus spoke Aramaic, and from Aramaic, whether it was translated to Hebrew or translated to eventually from Hebrew to Greek, and then from Greek to Latin, and then from Latin to English, the concept of days became like human days. But in Arabic and in Aramaic, days are periods. They don't connote the 24-hour cycle. They connote periods. I wonder if what the original was, because the possibility that the original said that God rested on the 7th day is impossible. There is no chance that God would have said that. But it's lost. It's lost because in the Roman mythology, gods rested. And when I say Christianity was Romanized, that's a very big topic. But among the issues is that in Roman mythology, gods rested. All the pantheon of gods needed to rest. In the same way that they procreated, by the way. And in the same way that they ate and they drank and they did all types of things. But the Romanization of Christianity, among the products of that was the idea of God needing to rest. But anyway, and also it existed in Babylonian mythology, which passed from Babylonian culture into the Old Testament. Okay. Anyway, so that God created God created creation in these 6 periods, but here we notice in Surah Yunus is that often when we have this introduction about creation, the Quran will then proceed to remind us of all the various blessings that Allah bestowed upon us. And Surah Yunus will do some of that, but not to the same extent as in other surah. But the emphasis here in Surah Yunus is on something very interesting, on understanding the proper relationship between to put it in a word, the proper relationship between, let's use it for now and qualify it later. The proper relationship between friends of God or potential friends of God, awliya-illah, and especially in relationship to something that is very fascinating, and that is especially in relationship to the concept of darar, harm, as we will see. Now, if you're paying attention, you'd say, isn't that what's going to happen to Muslims? In their journey, they're going to confront a great deal of harm. After the Isra, their persecution is going to escalate, and the answer is yes, precisely. And Surah Yunus and Hud and Yusuf challenged Muslims to understand the harm that will befall them in highly elevated and highly in a highly sagacious ways, wisdom-filled ways. It is as if saying, and I'm skipping ahead, but it is as if saying, you know, your Lord understands. Pain could break you, but pain could also elevate you. And it all depends on what you do with it. As inshallah we will see. So, in verse 3, the first thing that Surah Yunus will insist, other than reminding us of creation, is that ما من شفيع إلا من بعد إذنه. You have to understand something about a relationship with Allah. Intercession as a matter of right or human privilege, that's history. Now, for your modern mind, because all of you are the product of the modern world, which literacy is fairly widespread, and you know, you live in homes with amenities and things like that. You say, well, yeah, but what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that, as we said before, for centuries throughout humanity, in the same way that people today tend to take God for granted and make God pretty much as if God exists to rubber stamp whatever they desire and feel. You know, if you've ever read the Bible, and the Bible is very clear about sexual relations out of wedlock. One of the things that is like clear in the Bible, you know, one of the most puzzling things is how widespread in modern Western Christianity people will be church goers. I know tons of people who are regular church goers, but have children out of wedlock. They go with their boyfriends and girlfriends and their children that they've had out of wedlock to church every Sunday. And it is quite rare, and I've actually attended many sermons in my day, quite rare to hear a sermon in church anymore about sex out of wedlock. That's a product of the personalization of God, and where God is no longer your supreme, but God is there to basically rubber stamp whatever you want. God has become your personal cheerleader. The idea of the divine writ and the divine law had been deconstructed into pretty much nothing. So God is there to love you and give you salvation. And in return, nothing. God just loves you unconditionally, like your mother, your father, like the husband you want or the wife you want, the boyfriend that you will never find and the girlfriend that you will never find. So you project it onto God, unconditional love. I can do whatever I want, but God will always love me. Because as human beings, that's what we fantasize. Love without responsibility. Love without responsibility. It's a very, very appealing idea. But it's also a very problematic and a very morally troubling idea. You are loved whether you are a serial killer or whether you are whether you're a Hitler or whether you are Stalin or whether you are, it's a very morally problematic idea. But nevertheless, there you go. You know, the human beings, as we will see in Surah Yunus, because Surah Yunus talks about this and warns us about all of this. SubhanAllah, I mean, so I'm actually not digressing, I'm just skipping ahead, and as I said, the challenge is in presentation. But at the same time, so the point about that I was making, but at the same point now, in the pre-modern mind, and I've talked about this before, human beings had a very difficult time understanding or accepting that God can be approached without intercession. Why? I'm not being professorial, believe me, it's not like I want to complicate my halaqas, but I just can't, Muslims cannot be unintelligent. You know, you can't dumb down knowledge when it comes to Islam, you can't. So why was it that the idea that God was not accessible without intercession? Because human beings thought of authority in these terms. Authority was not something that was accountable to them. Greek democracy, by the way, was a myth, because the Greek democracy was for a group of elite who were equally privileged, so they can all have a say. But the idea of democracy, the way we use it today, took centuries to develop. Why? Because the idea of demystifying authority, the idea that those who own the manor, or those who own the castle, or those who own the farm, or those who rule the kingdom, are actually just human beings just like me, took centuries to develop. So, and those who ruled often claimed degrees of divinity. And so the idea of an accessible God was very dangerous. People in power were terrified of the idea of an accessible God. That's why the Persian Empire mystified the idea of a deity to the point that it is truly inaccessible to us today. Zoroastrianism was reinvented after Islam, but original pre-Islamic Zoroastrianism, the idea of God was practically incomprehensible. So did Christianity, and so did Judaism. So, but even, and this is like Judaism and Christianity and Zoroastrianism, but every religious creed always imagined that if rulers were not directly accessible, then how about God? And rulers themselves were very keen about supporting a priestly class that they would control, but that would maintain the mythology of intercession. Because it was the way that you kept the masses humble and complacent. When Islam came and said no to intercession, it was a revolution. Sitting today, us as a defeated people, as a colonized people, as a people who have been shamed for their authoritarianism, for a people who have been shamed for their despotism, as a people whose history is written by not them, but those who don't like them, as a people whose philosophy, the story of their philosophy, the story of even their law, is written by, as sitting here, as all that, we don't no longer understand the extent to which it was a revolution. But when Islam came and said, you know what, you don't need intercession, and in fact, no intercession, it was a revolution in the Near East. Mecca, they were rational human beings. They saw the Prophet as a troublemaker because of the doctrines of Islam. So what happens to our priestly class? So what happens to the privileges that the priestly class has given to this tribe and this tribe and that tribe and this tribe? Privileges that go back centuries. And you're coming today and telling us all of that is just mythology and nonsense? And any Joe Mo can just sit there and just pray in the desert and access God? What type of world do you want us to live in? Yeah, I don't want to go off on a tangent, so okay, I'll restrain myself. Okay. Now, note then, Surah Yunus comes and says, okay, so no intercession except, and as will come in Surah Yunus, it says, إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ min ba'di idhnih in Surah Yunus, but that with was God's permission. But Surah Yunus will say, if you claim God's permission, you have to produce evidence. We'll see that in a second. If you don't have evidence, you can't claim that you have God's permission. That was another revolution. Okay, so then the second prong immediately is in verse 4, is that to all of you, you will come back, and the Quranic insistence, not for the first time in Surah Yunus, obviously, but the underscoring yet again that accountability is going to be according to qist, justice. No status, no race, no class, no gender, free or slave are the same. It is going to be a standard of qist. Now again, don't think with your modern mind where you take so much for granted. So much for granted that a lot of things have lost meaning in our life, including justice. We don't even know what it is anymore because we take it so for granted. But in the mind of this developing, evolving human being was, you mean my slave is going to be able to say, you've beat me X number of times and you were just letting off steam and you had no right to do it? Remember all the stories you learn from the Surah where the Prophet ﷺ stands there and he tells common people, if I have offended you unjustly, exact your punishment from me, and he uncovers his stomach. We read this stuff today and we say, oh yeah, that's cool. But you have to understand that historically, these were revolutionary acts. And by the way, if we understand them for what they are, they're still revolutionary acts. It's just that Muslims today, they like read these as bedtime stories, and then they go worship their leaders in Iran and Egypt and Syria and Jordan and but no serious Muslim will insist on a leader that they can exact this type of justice from, as much as they insist on the hijab, for instance. I mean, they'll have epileptic fits about whether a woman is covering her hair or not, but they won't care whether their leader is yet another pharaoh. You know, maybe that's why I'm going to leave this world unpopular, but in my view, that's corrupting Islam beyond repair. That's not the religion that was given to us. Okay. Then, after this quick affirmation of these revolutionary pillars, accessibility of the divine, the overwhelming principle of qist, of justice, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then moves to the created Quran with, again, a brief elaboration. One of the things that I just Surah Yunus, that's so much. Okay, but among the things that I should flag so I can sleep at night is that I forgot to mention this, but on the issue of qadam as-sidq, a sure stand or a steadfast stand with your Lord. Surah Yunus will, as I said, will talk about the friends of God. Especially in Sufi-esque literature, there is some of the most profoundly eloquent discourses on why is it that it is part of Allah's sunnah in creation that human beings have a very difficult time recognizing the friends of God, awliyaullah, or even if they recognize them, treating them properly. And it's a discourse that, as modern Muslims, we're not often exposed to, or if we're exposed to it, because of the nature of the material presented, where we read it as these sort of outlandish stories from Sufi circles, but part of the, in order for choice to be preserved, and in order for beauty to remain preserved, it cannot be corrupted by egoism. And so there is a wonderful discourse, just usually that centers around the very beginning of Surah Yunus, about not just that the secrets of developing a relationship of closeness to Allah, that you become as if a friend, but how you go out of your way to not bring attention to this relationship. And in fact, if you find someone that brings attention to this relationship, then they're nobody. That in fact, they're not a friend of God. So, if you find someone who claims to be a Sufi and they go around like a rock star, then that's a pretty sure bet that they're a false friend. Or a TV star in our days, or a social media star. The nature of wilaya is self-effacement and dissimulation. That in fact you can reveal it to those who deserve to know it, but those who don't, you don't. The other thing that I'll note in Ihya Ulum al-Din, Ihya Ulum al-Din, in the part where Sheikh Ghazali talks about or mentions, it's been years since, of course, I've read this, but if my memory serves me right, where he talks about the beginning of Surah Yunus, and I'll mention this because Ihya Ulum al-Din has been translated to English, so you can actually read it for yourself if you don't know Arabic. That the relationship, again, and this is all around the concept of qadam sidq, is steadiness of the steady platform that you stand on, is how there are those who forget God, and so God causes them or then allows them to forget themselves. But there are those who are even worse than that, who claim to remember God, but their entire remembrance of God is really just a remembrance of the self. They inflate the self and make it the center point of the remembrance. So really their remembrance of God is nothing but a form of egoism. And Ihya Ulum al-Din, Imam al-Ghazali talks about how that in both cases, the fate of both these types of people is that they become as if baha'im, or worse, like cattle. But then in the Ihya, it talks about how the second type, the one that inflates the ego and so on, that they are worse because they are become like cattle that becomes sickly and spreads a disease among the flock. If I could remember what volume it's in, I would have told you, but I'm sure if you look for it, you'll find it. Just if you buy the Ihya that was published, translated by Islamic Text Society, and just look in the index for Surah Yunus and you'll find it. Okay, let's move on. So now we're at verse 5, that Allah who has created الشمس ضياء والقمر نور. God who made the sun, the study Quran say is translated as radiance, and the moon a light. وقدره منازل لتعلموا عدد السنين والحساب ما خلق الله ذلك إلا بالحق يفصل الآيات لقوم يعلمون إن في اختلاف الليل والنهار وما خلق الله في السماوات والأرض لآيات لقوم يتقون. The only thing I'll note about this, in Sufi, well, two things actually I'll note about this. In Sufi-esque literature, this, as if you've been following Tafsir, you know that when they talk about Shams and Al-Qamar, it's always understood metaphorically. But even out beyond the Sufi-esque tradition, one of the most fascinating things is, and we've encountered this before, is that when you say Al-Shams Diya, according to a medieval dictionary like Taj al-Arus, Diya is something that emits light of itself, while Nur is something that reflects light but doesn't generate it from itself. That's why a human being would have nur, not diya, because the light that you have as a human being is said to come from God. Not that you generate that light, but you simply reflect the light. Now, of course, in the modern world, it's remarkable because, for a medieval text to make that distinction, that the sun actually generates light, but the moon just reflects light, that's pretty remarkable, whether you believe in the whole science of the Quran or not. But just objectively, I think that's quite remarkable. The other thing that is worth noting about the Sufi tradition, I think we had a question before about the maqamat, that the stations that the Sufis often talk about. And in Tafsir ibn Ajiba, I just found a quick reference to the maqamat which I couldn't remember. So التوبة والخوف والرجاء والورع والزهد والصبر والشكر والرضا والتسليم والمحبة والمراقبة والمشاهدة. So the translation, rough translation, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because this would take us, you could spend months just talking about each maqam. At-tawbah wal-khawf is, and we've encountered this before, that you start out with repentance and learning reverence of God or the fear of God. Wal-raja wal-wara. Raja is, the best way to translate it is to learn to trust and to count on God. Wal-wara is the internalization of your awareness of God. Was-zuhd was-sabr. Zuhd is to learn to de-emphasize the parts of you that are materialistic. Zuhd is not necessarily that you go without anything or property, but zuhd is that material things are pulled out of your heart. Was-sabr is patience and endurance. Was-shukr wal-rida. Shukr is, which is often described as one of the most challenging maqam, is to learn the meaning of gratitude. because we are often not grateful until we don't have something. And it's a very infantile way of learning gratitude. When a very undeveloped human being, they can only be grateful for something when they lose it. So I don't know how to be grateful for my eyesight unless I become blind. That's how an infantile, undeveloped psychology works. But when you learn gratitude, you don't have to be denied something to learn to be grateful for it. Warida is to learn satisfaction and acceptance of God's will. والتسليم والمحبة. Taslim is precisely surrender, where you surrender your affairs to the one and only, as the one and only, meaning the one and only, al-wahid al-ahad. Everything else is but a delusion. So you only surrender to the only real thing. And al-mahabba is love. At that point, then you are ready to love, because you're not going to fall in love with yourself and then project it onto God. But hopefully you will actually fall in love with God as God. And you will be ready to receive the enlightenments of God, which then gets you ready for the stage of al-muraqaba wal-mushahada. And that's when you are receiving the futuhat. That's when Allah allows you to experience something of the divine blessings in illuminations and light. The light becomes something that you don't experience, once on a miraculous occasion, but pretty much something that you can experience whenever you humbly call upon God. And the light propels your consciousness to something completely different, because then you understand things like dimensions, like time and space, and so on. But it's very interesting that in Surah Yunus, which in the Sufi tradition they often talk about why it was very important that it came after the Isra, you have a lot about that. Okay, so إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات يهديهم ربهم بإيمانهم تجري من تحتهم الأنهار في جنات النعيم دعوتهم فيها سبحانك اللهم وتحيتهم فيها سلام وآخر دعواهم أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. This verse 10 is among the most beautiful du'as that you learn, and that's, by the way, the dhikr for this surah. دعواهم فيها سبحانك اللهم وتحيتهم فيها سلام وآخر دعواهم أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. So in verse 9 we understand that Allah is talking about the Jannah, but look at the way verse 10 Allah elevates those who are ready for an elevation, for this type of elevation, for a more mature understanding of Jannah. دعواهم فيها سبحانك. This is 10. We've talked about tasbih before, right? And that tasbih Allah wa tanzih Allah. that you understand the singular glory of Allah, the unlikeness of Allah to anything. Well, in Jannah, to attain an understanding for in what way Allah is the center of all of existence and is the only reality in existence, what you receive in return for this understanding is something that the human soul lives coveting from the moment of consciousness to the moment of death, attaining it only perhaps a few times or on rare occasions, but not ever completely and thoroughly. And what you attain is salam, is true peace and harmony. In Sufi-esque literature, there is a great deal written about why it must be so that absolute, true, pure salam can only be attained with perfect knowledge. But that perfect knowledge is not possible in the temporal plane. Without perfect knowledge, then whatever peace you imagine is also an incomplete understanding of peace. Because even if you surrender to the divine will completely, you don't really understand why this child died in this country, why these people drowned in the sea, why there was a volcano, or you don't. And so you don't understand what true peace is, because not all the pieces of the puzzle come together. But here it is where in Surah Yunus is in several places after the Isra, where the Quran gives hints that there's a perception of Jannah that is as material as those who set their heart on material things. But that's not the real attainment. وَتَحِيَّتُهُمْ فِيهَا سَلَامٌ. Now, of course, in the traditional tafsir, they say that the angels will stand and greet you with peace. But as again in the Sufi-esque tradition point out, well, that seems to be a mere formality. How much pleasure or how much happiness or how much tranquility is that mere formality will bring you if all that is happening is that the angels are there just standing and saying, oh, peace. But وَتَحِيَّتُهُمْ فِيهَا سَلَامٌ, and their greeting is peace. It comes from tahiyyatuhum, which is the same word from which the word haya, life. So the very source of life for them will become that peace. وآخر دعواهم أن الحمد لله رب العالمين, that this is the stage where hamd, where gratitude and thanks to Allah becomes inseparable from inner peace. So this is why, and again, I'm just passing, just flagging these things because I want to get to the whole, the overall point of Surah Yunus, if we're able to, inshallah. Um, um, Sufi-esque tafsir, and I think this is in, well, Sufi-esque tafsir. I don't want to, because I can't remember where that often mention that a story sometimes attributed to a prophet, sometimes attributed to one of the Sufi masters, sometimes even attributed to a Jewish worshipper, meaning of ancient times, that this man, whoever that man was, starts pondering the fact that he often disobeys God, and God doesn't punish him, and that he often commits sin and God keeps giving him. And he finally sits and talks to God and say, you know, I don't get it. Why is it that I keep disobeying you and you keep giving me? This is not the way we understand how you deal with others. And finally, Allah answers in this, narrative, that finally Allah answers this person, whoever that person was, and says, it is because, and this became, by the way, like one of the mantras in Sufism, is because inni ana wa anta ant. This is because I am who I am and you are who you are. So in the Sufi path, do you see how much Surah Yunus has inspired in the tradition of Islamic spiritualism? In the Sufi path, the goal is to internalize this so that understanding how to be more like the divine self through the sifat, through the attributes of Allah, is the aspirations. So you know that Allah continues to bless, although Allah continues to be disobeyed. And Allah continues to give, although Allah continues to be disobeyed. And Allah continues to be good, although people are consistently not good with Allah. And so that becomes the Sufi aspiration. A long time ago, I was attending a halaqah, and one of my teachers said, only the most fortunate of human beings can understand and fully internalize this lesson. And he said also, it just stayed with me, any one of you that will claim that they've comprehended that lesson before they are old men is probably a liar. Just stayed with me. Man, I can't believe we just did 10 ayat. Do you see my dilemma? I want to speed up. I really do. I just... the people here are not happy that I said speed up. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. SubhanAllah, I mean, it's been 2 hours and only 10 ayat, and still I forgot something. And Ayah 7, إن الذين لا يرجون لقاءنا ورضوا بالحياة الدنيا واطمأنوا بها والذين هم عن آياتنا غافلون أولئك مأواهم النار بما كانوا يكسبون. This is 7 and 8. And as just keep in mind, inshallah, we'll come to the end and I will pull the entire surah together for you. But for now, we'll just all the necessary building blocks. This was in Surah Yunus, was the first time that the Quran starts building upon a very important theme, that there is something more than simply a reward or punishment in the hereafter. So there is justice, accountability, but the thing that is more is whether you as a human being in fact start reflecting and gaining an understanding of the fact that you came from something truly magnanimous, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that you will return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that in this concept of coming and return is as simple and straightforward as it is, but just reflect upon it. Just put it, make it a homework to reflect upon the idea of meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meeting your maker. We've turned it into something of just an idiomatic expression, meeting your maker, and often we've even turned it as an equivalent to the idea of death. And it doesn't raise anything elevated in us. But that those who have become settled in life on earth and have psychologically accepted the idea that life on earth is their home, and they feel no sense of alienation because they don't miss Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when Surah Yunus in ayah number 7, when it warns that those who have become settled in life on earth and acquiesced in the idea that life on earth is the beginning and end all, and that they don't actually long for their Lord, they don't long to meet their Lord. Muslims became concerned because they said, well, what if we try but we don't have that feeling? And then the Prophet ﷺ reminded them that Surah Yunus in the same ayah says, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ آيَاتِنَا غَافِلُونَ, that it's not just you don't long, but you have become also oblivious to the messages of your Lord. And then the Prophet ﷺ elaborated upon this when he the Prophet summarized the whole concept in a very important hadith that I wish we would teach to our children in the right way. And this is the hadith that's been reported in cumulatively, that whoever loves man ahabba liqa Allah ahabba Allahu liqa'ah, that whoever loves to meet Allah, Allah will love to meet him or her. And whoever doesn't love to meet Allah, Allah will not love meeting him or her. And that's, as of course, as you would expect, it's a Sufi-esque tafsir that take this to a higher, write quite a bit about it. But the idea of disciplining the self to not accept life on this earth as the end all, and not accept a sense of settlement in life of this earth that this is home. B, to try to wean into the self, miss Allah. Imagine what it would be like if death for you is not death, but it's the beginning of an opportunity to actually meet the beloved. Your whole outlook shifts. It's like, I miss you. I miss you because I feel you. I miss you because I felt you all my life. And when I die, I know that, and this is where your certitude starts developing at another level. When I die, I'm not going to worry about, my understanding of heaven and hell, what the nature of material things will be, what the nature of fire will be, what the nature of rivers will be, what the nature of honey will be, what the nature of wine will be. That's not where I'm going to put my energy. I'm going to put my energy at the simple fact that you are my maker, and I am from you, and I return to you, and I miss you. In the Sufi tradition, they always say that this is the beginning of maqam al-hub. This is the beginning of the station of love. When you want to learn to love Allah, you first start on the azkar, the azkar of longing, the azkar of missing, the I miss you azkar. But even beyond the Sufi tradition, this is even in traditional Islam. I don't know any traditional source that denies the authenticity of this hadith, or especially that this hadith is mentioned in the context of Surah Yunus. And it came shortly right after the Isra, where the Prophet ﷺ, with the people who stayed Muslim, is saying, okay, because you keep in mind another thing, the Isra became so mythologized that all these traditions about how the Prophet ﷺ goes and he visits hell, and then he sees people being tortured this way and people being tortured that way and people tortured this way, and the vast majority of these ahadith are not authentic. But yet we raise our children teaching them about the Isra and saying that, this is what they learn. But what they don't learn is, in fact, what followed the Isra is that now you are the true believers who are willing, who accepted, know that this is a truthful prophet. And that the prophet would not lie. If the prophet says, Usriya bi, Usriya bi. That if the prophet went on the Isra, then that means. But that the prophet didn't come back, alayhi salatu wasalam, to regale them with tales of the tortures and hellfire, as happened you find in the, especially in the Christian tradition, which at that time Catholicism was all about inzar, about warning, not about good news. But in fact, what the focus after the Isra was, understand that the Isra is a journey from the lover to the beloved. And that's why in Sufi literature, the Isra has a huge and great symbolism. Ya Rab. Ya Rab. Okay, then we'll go to now. I told you that Surah Yunus was the beginning of the dynamics of dur, of harm. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then starts immediately after this, as you know, it took us 2 hours just to cover these verses because they are very layered concepts that engage the believer in an elevation of the spirit to then talk about the very core issue that is about to confront Muslims. Allah is aware of it, but they're not necessarily aware of it. And that is the test of harm. وَلَوْ يُعَجِّلُ اللَّهُ لِلنَّاسِ الشَّرَّ اسْتِعْجَالَهُمْ بِالْخَيْرِ لَقُضِيَ إِلَيْهِمْ أَجَلُهُمْ فَانذِرِ الَّذِينَ لَا يَرْجُونَ لِقَاءَنَا فنظر الذين لا يرجون لقاءنا في طغيانهم يعمهون وإذا مس الإنسان الضر دعانا لجنبه أو قاعدا أو قائما فلما كشفنا عنه ضره مر كأن لم يدعنا إلى ضر مسه كذلك زين للمسرفين ما كانوا يعملون ولقد أهلكنا القرون من قبلكم لما ظلموا وجاءتهم رسلهم بالبينات وما كانوا ليؤمنوا كذلك نجزي القوم المجرمين ثم جعلناكم خلائف في الأرض من بعدهم لننظر كيف تعملون. So let's take 11 and 12 first. So here you get reports that again claim that the occasion for revelation is that Mecca suffered a 7-year drought and that the drought was quite severe and caused Meccans a lot of hardship. And that they went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, pray to your God to bring the drought to an end. And the Prophet ﷺ indeed prayed that the drought would end, and it ended. But once the drought ended, they of course went back and said, well, thanks for nothing, this was just nature. Or this was our gods, or in other words, they reneged. And again, I don't doubt the authenticity of the historical event. I mean, it's not at all surprising if in the polemics of the time, if Meccans would go to the Prophet and say, well, if you're a real prophet, why don't you bring an end to this drought? And then the drought ends and they say, well, no, it's not. You didn't do it. Our gods did it, or whoever did it. That's very consistent with human psychology and the way human beings work. They'll pray for something, they'll get it, and they'll come up with whatever reason about why they got it, anything other than what they initially were saying. But I think when people focus, as traditional tafsir do, on this as being the occasion for revelation, they take away an important message, especially why now we're at verse 11, and we will see that from verse 11 to verse 100, when we start talking about the prophets Nuh and Musa and Yunus, and the theme of harm is consistently in Surah Yunus, then you miss the point, because you think that the occasion is just to tell Meccans, shame on you, you prayed for the end of the drought and it ended and then you reneged. But so while I think that these verses apply to the historical event, I don't think that was the occasion for revelation, as is often claimed. But rather, what Surah Yunus then starts engaging the audience of the Quran to reflect on is the very idea of harm. And it starts out by something that is a bit of a challenge for people to truly theorize and comprehend. And that is, it's as if saying, if only you knew what follies Allah saves you from. And here is an important point, interestingly raised in more philosophically oriented texts, like the works of Qadi Abdul Jabbar, for instance, is that human beings are often, they're happy, of course, when good things happen to them, and when bad things happen, they're often traumatized, bothered, and quite frequently blame God for the suffering, whatever the suffering is. But the reality is, if you take the external view of things, and you will find that human beings' perception of good and bad is incomplete and myopic, in that they often want what is good for them and wish bad on others, or at least don't care if bad befalls others. So whether, if you take the God view of things, so the God view of things is God is hearing human beings constantly have gripes, have grievances, have vengeance, want to wish harm upon the other. And if God would listen, in fact, to human beings and treat human beings equally, the earth and life on earth would have come to an end a long time ago, because the amount of evil that human beings wish upon one another is truly astounding. So, while evil or bad things occur, but God is constantly softening the impact or intervening to save human beings from their follies. And their follies is not just the way that they plan and plot against each other, but from what they wish and hope for one another. Now, in more advanced thinking, like the thought of Mullah Sadra and so on, like for instance, the folly of inequality, that those who think about the unfairness of inequality are often those who do not have. But once they have, they suddenly become not troubled by inequality. And that no thinking about the nature of good and bad can be mature or real unless it takes that holistic view of things. But the crux of the matter is this relativistic and self-centered attitude. And the self-centered attitude is وَإِذَا مَسَّ الْإِنسَانَ الضُّرُّ دَعَانَا لِجَنْبِهِ, that when a human being suffers, says ouch, a human being or longs or desires. Now contrast this between longing for utility versus longing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a point that always often noted by Sufis, but anyway, that human beings then becomes fervent in their dua, and fervent دعانا لجنبه أو قائما أو قاعدا أو قائما. They remember God as if God is a close companion, a close buddy, as if they had God consciousness all along. And so much so that it will become as if whether they're lying down, whether they're sitting, whether they're standing up. Take any human being who is all their, who is, and here is an important concept, who is an agnostic. An agnostic in the non-philosophical sense, in the sense that the more people like Zamakhshari or people like Qadi Abdul Jabbar, they is those who are non-committal about God. It's like, well, they claim an open mind, but in fact, their open mind is a lack of commitment. So that agnostic is full of skepticism. And that skepticism makes them treat God as a Rabb, but not as an Ilah. Remember, we talked about this. As a Rabb meaning as you are there as a God to give me, but not an Ilah. You're not there as a God to demand of me. And if they feel that God demands of them, even if it is for the good of others, they're on guard. Really? Why? Is this really your law? Is this really your will? Is this really what's good? Is this really your, so on. But if it is something that will benefit them, they're far more relaxed. Now, that agnostic, from the time of the Greeks, when the Gnostics used to criticize the agnostics, as Qadi Abdul Jabbar points out, that the thing that the Greek believers used to criticize about their agnostics is their hypocritical selves. If that they are nonchalant and non-committal and claim open mind, but the one time they become fervent about the presence of God is when they're in trouble. So take any person full of skepticism. You know, they have a good job, whatever. Suddenly, their mother falls ill and is on their deathbed. Or suddenly, their child falls ill as on their deathbed. Or suddenly, they discover they have an incurable cancer, and so on. And suddenly, they are fully God conscious. But that lasts only as long as that need lasts. And that is what كَذَلِكَ زُيِّنَ لِلْمُسْرِفِينَ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. Musrifin here, they translated in the study Quran as prodigal. The Musrifin here are people of inequity. They are people of fundamental inequity in their character. So, of course, the implication to the Muslim is that if your relationship to Allah is guided by the same logic, i.e. you are yourself a musrif, you are very close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in hardship, and you're very clear-minded about Allah's truth and about the hereafter and so on at times of hardship, but then you quickly find yourself that your heart drifts away as long as the hardship is removed, or all your pettiness and all your complaints and all your self-indulgences return. Now here it is the case that you are not on a qadam sidq, you are not on a steadfast platform with your Lord. Remember at the beginning of the surah? And that you are not among those who actually yuhibbu liqa Allah, that you are not among those who loves meeting your Lord. The nature of the musrif is that indeed God is there as a functional source to perform a function, but nothing beyond that. The problem, whether you need God to give you power or to give you money or to give you health or to give you career or to give you marriage or to give you whatever you want God to give you. The problem is the relationship with God upon which everything else is going to be built is not on a stable, steadfast platform. Qadam sidq. But then Surah Yunus takes you from the personal to a further view. And that it's starting to talk about what happened to communities. Now just pay attention to this, and because we're going to come back to it. So it says, don't forget that وَلَقَدْ أَهْلَكْنَا القُّرُونَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَمَّا ظَلَمُوا وَجَاءَتْهُمْ رُسُلُهُم بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَمَا كَانُوا لِيُؤْمِنُوا كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي القَّوْمَ الْمُجْرِمِينَ ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ خَلَائِفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ لِنَنْظُرَ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ. So nations before you were destroyed. And here's one of the interesting grammatical debates and point of tafsir. لَمَّا ظَلَمُوا. You notice here it says لَمَّا ظَلَمُوا وَجَاءَتْهُمْ رُسُلُهُم بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ. So we've destroyed past nations when they committed zulm, when they were unjust. And جاءتهم رسلهم بالبينات, and their prophets came to them with the truth, with the message, and they rejected them. And the debate is about the wa here. Is it that they were unjust because they rejected the prophets? Or is it that they were unjust and they rejected the prophets? Now, the best thing that I've read on this point is, of course, those who, in my view, understood precisely, is that the prophets are there, among other things, and core to their message is justice. So for you, there's no way of accepting the prophets and feeling justice. Something that I wish modern Muslims would understand. That if you truly understand the message of the Prophet, it is the message of Allah, and Allah is justice. So you can't say, oh, I accept Allah's message, but just injustice doesn't trouble me. As we will see actually in the rest of Surah Yunus. So then comes the challenge, and remember, these are persecuted Muslims. I mean, they don't have those who have even immigrated to Ethiopia hasn't happened yet, or Abyssinia, it's about to happen. But then it comes and tells them, and made you the inheritors to see what you will do. So a lot of the traditional tafsir paused at this and said, well, it must be talking to the Meccans. Because how could it be talking to Muslims when Muslims haven't inherited anything? But I think they miss the point when they do that. Because remember, what we said before, time and space. Allah is, in retrospect, we know that Allah was telling Muslims, you will inherit. But don't you dare be like these past nations who've corrupted the messages of their prophets and have become unjust. I'm sorry I flipped pages, but because of the illness before the halaqah, I'm like forced to sit and just jot down whatever I can remember. And you know, the way memory works is not very organized. Okay. وَإِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُنَا بَيِّنَاتٍ. This is 15. بَيِّنَاتٍ قَالَ الَّذِينَ لَا يَرْجُونَ لِقَاءَنَا ائْتِ بِقُرْآنٍ غَيْرَ هَذَا أَوْ بَدِّلْهُ قُلْ مَا يَكُونُ لِي أَنْ أُبَدِّلَهُ مِنْ تِلْقَاءِ نَفْسِي إِنْ أَتَّبِعُ إِلَّا مَا يُوحَى إِلَيَّ إني أخاف إن عصيت ربي عذاب يوم عظيم قل لو شاء الله ما تلوته عليكم ولا أدراكم به فَقَدْ لَبِثْتُ فِيكُمْ عُمُرًا مِنْ قَبْلِهِ أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. So what is the relationship in 15 and 16 to what comes before? If you're not paying attention, you'll miss the relationship. Right away, the Quran comes and says that remember that this inequitous relationship with the divine, this highly personalized this highly egocentric relationship with the divine is a problem. In that relationship where, well, I need God when I'm in trouble, it is a problem. And in fact, people without, and here's the key, people without ethical standards based on divine command are people who are inequitous because they think it is up to them whether they have justice or injustice, as if injustice can be fine with God. But in fact, the divine command doesn't give you that choice. The divine command makes justice an imperative, makes morality an imperative, makes ethics an imperative. You are not free to mistreat a race, you are not free to mistreat a class, you are not free to mistreat a gender because it is more convenient or it is and you are not free to deify your rulers, and you're not free to claim that people are not equal, i.e. the concept of intercession. You're not free. That is the whole point of ethics based on divine command. And those who then rejected that and brought back injustice, God replaced them. Now, it's your turn. But there is a problematic, is that in the same way that there were those who thought that the Isra and Mi'raj was about the Prophet as a person, that this was like about a miracle, like the old biblical miracles of the Bible. The Quran comes basically and says, it is not about the Prophet. How many times does the Quran say, what if Muhammad dies? Muhammad is just a man. It is not about the Prophet. And the point about this thing, the Meccans come to Muhammad and say, okay, we don't like this in the Quran, we don't like that in the Quran. And what is it that they don't like? What is it that the reports tell us that they don't like? What they don't like is precisely the idea that the elite cannot be the elite, and that the slaves are equal to the free, and that the honored Arab tribes are equal to every other. There's no difference between an Arab and a Persian, or a black and white. This is precisely what they don't like. And we've encountered before when they tell Muhammad, okay, exclude the poor people and we'll sit and talk to you. And the Quran comes and says, you can't do that. No way. Not even open to negotiations. And we've encountered in Abasa wa Tawalla, when the blind man that comes and talks to the Prophet, the blind poor man that comes, and again, the Quran comes, and it's early on. And of course, Mecca is deeply offended by that. And so they come to the Prophet and say, okay, change this, and we can find common grounds. And the Quran comes and affirms this precisely this thing about the ethical order based on divine will. That it is not up to you, Muhammad, and tell them that it's not up to you. I can't change anything. It is not up to me to make deals with you. And yes, I know that as things are turning grim to Muslims, I mean, they need a break. They need any type of negotiated deal to give them a break. There are people who are being tortured to death, and people who are being starved to death. And we all know the stories about after the death of Khadija and the starving of Muslims, and they would starve so badly that their stomachs was blown up with gas, so they tie a rock around the stomach to try to control the expansion of their stomach from gas. When you're very hungry, you know, your stomach bloats up with gas. So you're talking about real starvation. And yet the Quran comes and says, no. This is a message. It's not about negotiated settlements and agreements. A divine message without its ethical core and backbone is no longer a message. This is the biggest fallacy that Muslims have fallen in, is that you are free to play politics, and politics has no morality. Yeah, we have a name for that, and that's secularism. Immoral politics. But if you want something counter to secularism, principles, ethics, internal and external. Internal and external. And the Quran is so decisive about this that it says that those who think that that it is up to the Prophet ﷺ to, tweak things, and those people لا يرجون لقاءنا, hearkening back to what لا يرجون لقاءنا, they don't want to meet us. لا يرجون لقاءنا is like saying, you know what, it's not that they just don't want to meet us, but لا يرجون لقاءنا means like we don't want to meet them. Hearkening back to what the Prophet ﷺ said, those who love to meet Allah, it is like Allah telling you, if you don't understand that your Islam is about these principles that become core, and you will see that it even goes more than that in a second, then don't think you can fool anyone by saying, yeah, you're among those who looks forward to meeting Allah. For all of you who don't understand, why is it that I am so critical of Muslim governments in Saudi and Emirat and Egypt and God knows everywhere? Because I don't see any ethics. I see Muslim governments as the most unethical governments on the face of this planet. It is this, because it is not Islam anymore. Khalas. You might as well be Buddhist, I don't know, invent your own religion and call it Xanadu, whatever. But it is not Islam. It is not Islam. Okay. And of course, this is affirmed again in 18, that when you fail to understand this, when you in fact take away from Islam qist, adl, even the centrality of the divine rather than the ego. That is iftira ala Allah kaziban. That is, you are lying, or you are projecting lies onto Allah. You are making up lies and attributing them to Allah, which is a grand sin. It's a kabira. I mean, you can't imagine a sin bigger than that. This is as big as shirk or as kufr or whatever. And that puts you in the status of al-mujrimun. This is ayah number 17. Mujrimun, who are outright offenders. I mean, grand sinners. Then 18, وَيَعْبُدُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ مَا لَا يَضُرُّهُمْ وَلَا يَنْفَعُهُم وَيَقُولُونَ هَؤُلَاءِ شُفَعَاؤُنَا عِندَ اللَّهِ قُلْ أَتُنَبِّئُونَ اللَّهَ بِمَا لا يَعْلَمُ في السماوات ولا في الأرض سبحانه وتعالى عما يشركون. Now, of course, in traditional tafsir, they often say that this refers to the idols of Quraysh, that Quraysh would say the idols are interceders. They are just intercede for us on our behalf with God. But, of course, as Razi points out, that Quraysh didn't believe in a hereafter. So the idols were supposed to intercede in a very fake way. Because if there is no hereafter, so what are they interceding for? And again, as people like Zamakhshari or Razi point out, that this is not just about Quraysh and its idols, and that those who learn that this type of discourse is about Quraysh and its idols do an injustice to the Quran, because anything that you believe is going to bail you out in the hereafter, despite your failure to stick to principles, this ayah applies to you. So, if you simply count on oh, God is merciful, then your false God that will intercede on your is your hopefulness. You're taking God for granted. If you think that, oh, I am powerful and rich and I donate a whole bunch of money, so it's okay if I treat my ex-wife like garbage and I am unfair to my neighbors, then your false interceding God is your money and your power. Now, here is where it really gets troubling for modern Muslims, because they don't like to think that way. If you commit sin and you tell yourself, oh, it's okay because eventually I'll go to Hajj and Allah will forgive me, then yes, your interceding force, a false idol, is Hajj. So here, even God's law itself, if misused, can be a false idol. Anything that you are banking on to bail you out of living a principled life, like in the khutbah I gave Jum'ah, I was noticing these people who are just, living a very materialistic life and wearing revealing clothes, and they're supposed to be devout Muslims, and they're wearing mini jeeps and shorts and, low-cut stuff. And so I asked, I asked people, what do you think is going on in their mind? And some friends said, well, what's going on in their mind is that they're thinking, well, it's no big deal. Other people do much worse. oh, you know, eventually when I grow up, I'll go to Hajj and God will forgive me. Oh, you know, it's okay, I'm a good person, I donate a lot of money, so it's okay if I do that. That's precisely what the deficiency of Iman is. When you count on something bailing you out, when you consciously and knowingly did what is haram. And they say Khalid Abul Fadl is a liberal. Do I sound like a liberal to you? Then transition with me to 19. وما كان الناس إلا أمة واحدة فاختلفوا ولولا كلمة سبقت من ربك لقضي بينهم فيما فيه يختلفون. So this is 19, and you pause and say, oh, wait, what is the relationship between what we're talking about harm and the relationship between harm and Iman and the failure to construct your Iman on the commitment to the divine command. And suddenly then we're talking about that people were a single ummah, but then they disagreed, and if God would have willed, God would have kept them all together. What's the continuity here? And I submit to you that the continuity is very obvious. What Allah is saying is, human beings were a single ummah, meaning that they all had, when their needs and their experiences and their texts and their prophets were singular and unified, there were no differences between them. But with sophistication, i.e. with differences in experiences, with differences in prophets, with differences, because every ummah gets its messenger. But the messenger, if the messenger comes with a kalimat wahy, with a revealed text, then human beings start disagreeing about the meaning of the text. If they get different prophets, then human beings disagree about my prophet, your prophet. If they get the same prophet, but they have different languages and different cultural experiences, then they disagree about their different cultural experiences and different languages. Now, Allah comes and says, well, don't think that this is unintentional. Because if Allah would have willed, this wouldn't have happened. But, in fact, that is the sunnah of Allah in creation, difference. Now, why is it mentioned here? For a very simple reason. Because what is the thing that agnostics rely on to be agnostic? Well, there's so many religions, so many systems of belief, so many different this and that, so none of them can be true. So I'll just be an agnostic. This is precisely the response. Yes, there are differences, but don't let the existence of differences lead you into the confusion of believing that there's no truth because there are differences. Just because Allah allowed for the color gray to exist, it doesn't mean there's no black and white. And just because Allah allowed people to differ, it doesn't mean that there is no justice and there are no principles. So the challenge is to anchor yourself in truth. This, in spite of God's will, that humans have the freedom to disagree. Now, in the Muslim tradition, they went even, because when Muslims were more advanced civilizationally and more mature civilizationally, they understood things at a deeper level than we understand them. And so in Muslim texts, they often say that if that part of Allah's sunnah is that human beings will follow different awliya, that some will follow this waliullah, others will follow that waliullah, third will follow that waliullah, and that, or fuqaha, same. And that is part of the natural order of things. All the awliya and all the fuqaha must have a core truth that is invariable. But the variation and the ability of people to exercise choice is in fact a form of, in one statement, it's not a hadith, but an inherited wise statement, is described as a rahmah, as a mercy, and in others it's described as a form of ihsan, as a form of divine blessing. But the challenge is that diversity can never become an excuse for hedonism. Now, in 20, وَيَقُولُونَ لَوْلَا أُنزِلَ عَلَيْهِ آيَةٌ مِّن رَبِّهِ فَقُلْ إِنَّمَا الْغَيْبُ لِلَّهِ فَانْتَظِرُوا إِنِّي مَعَكُمْ مِنَ الْمُنْتَظِرِينَ. In 20, where now it addresses a common claim by the Meccans vis-a-vis the Prophet ﷺ. And it's simply that they say, well, if only some decisive proof comes down with the Prophet Muhammad. Just keep in mind the statement, فَانْتَظِرُوا إِنِّي مَعَكُمْ مِنَ الْمُنْتَظِرِينَ. That statement, well, okay, wait, for I am going to wait with you. Why? Because this will come back at the end of Surah Yunus. And the significance of this, you don't really understand or appreciate the significance of this until after the revelation of Surah Hud and Surah Yusuf, and then understanding what happens later in history. It's okay, the kuffar is saying to Prophet Muhammad, you have no proof. Many people think that the answer is, well, yeah, but it's the Prophet Muhammad doesn't have one of the biblical miracles. But the more accurate answer is the proof of the truth of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ only becomes evident if you understand the revelation and the way history unfolded. Because in Surah Yunus and Surah Hud and Surah Yusuf is a precise prediction of the miraculous, and that's the Prophet's ultimate victory. Something that was unthinkable at the time that these surahs are revealed. But when you understand what these surahs are saying, and then you look at what happened, and you say, wow, Mecca got their answer. They wanted an ayah. Well, their ayah is what it told them will happen in the surah actually happened. And Mecca, as in the tribe of Quraysh, the way it used to be, is no more. It is so easy for us to miss this point. But if look at how hard it is for anyone to get to get, I mean, I don't want to sound but how difficult it is for once Arabs drifted away from Islam to get Arabs to accomplish anything. Without Islam, what have Arabs accomplished? Absolutely nothing. But the true miracle is precisely that. Is that you take the least likely people to accomplish, and they in fact accomplish because of the divine miracle. I know, I'm an Arab, so I mean, I have no shame in saying that. I'm not one of these Egyptians who will say I'm a pharaonic, I'm not Arab. No, I'm an Arab. There are no pharaohs anymore. They're gone. If Egyptians only would grow up and realize that. By the way, Egyptians have been Arabs for a very long time, long before Islam came. But they of course like to think that there's something such as, anyway. Okay, so just keep 20 in mind. Someone told me that in one of the times I was hallucinating in pain, I apparently hallucinated about the burden of Surah Yunus. And now I understand why I hallucinated about that. Because, yeah, it weighs. I mean, there are other surahs that are this heavy, but I can't skip anything. That's the problem. Is I can't skip ayat and say, okay, well, there's nothing to add here, and that's the challenge. So I think we'll go to the latest is 10, and then we'll have to pick it up on Tuesday. It just, there's no way I'm going to finish Surah Yunus tonight. I'm sorry. Okay. So let's go now to 21. Okay. Now, so then Allah takes us back to that core issue of dur, harm, of darra. And saying, bringing us back to that essential dynamic of the what is that expression? It means like flighty believers, finicky, not finicky.
Fair weather? Fair weather?
Oh, fair weather believers. You know, they what I called agnostics because that's what Qadi Abdul Jabbar talks about. But it's they're, you know, the way that that notice here in 21, وَإِذَا أَذَقْنَا النَّاسَ رَحْمَةً مِنْ بَعْدَ ضَرَّاءٍ مَسَّتْهُمْ إِذَا لَهُمْ مَكْرٌ فِي آيَاتِنَا. And again, here the traditional tafsir will tell you, well, this has to do with the drought in Mecca, so on and so forth. But we've already talked about this. This is 21. Oh, really? Maghrib ends at 10? Huh?
10:07.
10:07? Well, can you can maybe end at 9:45 then?
Okay.
We'll end at 9:45 so we can pray Maghrib. Yeah, so anyway, that when people receive Allah's blessings, here expressed in the form of rahmah, min ba'du darra, they are no longer under pressure. لهم مكر في آياتنا. Now, the study Quran translates this as, it's probably going to translate it very literally again. It says, a plot regarding our signs. Very literal, to the point that it doesn't have any meaning. A plot regarding our signs. مكر في آياتنا. It's a profoundly eloquent way of saying they then start, it's like manipulating their thought processes to avoid dealing with our ayat, with the way that we in fact communicate with them. So it's like, I am in hardship, my heart is open temporarily. Then I start receiving Allah's blessings. But when I start receiving Allah's blessings, makrun fi ayatina, and remember I said before, that makr doesn't mean plotting. Makr doesn't mean plotting. Makr means uncharted or unplotted events that unfold. So makrun fi ayatina, then they start dealing with our signs in ways that are not straightforward. So they start saying, well, ignoring that Allah is telling them, now that you had the job that you always wanted, or now that I've cured you, or now that I've given you the family that you want, whatever it is. They start thinking, well, I deserve it. I'm brilliant. I'm accomplished. Well, I studied hard. Well, I work hard. Well, or they start not noticing. So before, they might have noticed poor people that need things. Suddenly, they're no longer noticing people in need. Before, they might have paid attention to where other human beings are suffering. Suddenly, now they don't pay attention anymore. Before, they might have been empathetic. Their views, and this is very common, by the way, where I used to practice immigration law a long time ago, and one of the things I used to notice is that before people would get their immigration papers and citizenship, they're very empathetic to the problems of immigrants. And then I would notice that, they become citizens for a few years, and suddenly they're hardline about other immigrants. And I would always think to myself, makrun fi ayatina. How pathetic. It didn't even take that long. Now that you're on the safe side, and that's what makrun fi ayatina means. It's not that you're sitting plotting against God. It means that you are, in a word, unethical, not straightforward, because your sense of right and wrong and your empathies, your observances, your intellectual processes shift because your interests shifted. So you're precisely that human being that Allah is talking about, who calls upon Allah lying down and walking and sleeping when they need something. But once they get it, well, God is most forgiving. Well, what, am I supposed to give everything to I have? I work very hard for what I have. I take you back again and say, why Muslims who are these are Muslims who stuck with the Prophet ﷺ after the Isra, who passed the hard test. And instead of telling them, okay, Allah, just don't worry, when you die, Allah will give you versions in heaven and give you everything. It comes and challenges them and says, well, yeah, congratulations for passing the test, but remember, so many people are with God without principles. And don't you dare be among those who are finicky and who will remember God when it's convenient and when it's not convenient for. And this is to people who are just about to face, or in fact started facing, severe persecution. Why am I saying this? For the Muslims that I feel sorry for, who, again, influenced by Islamophobia and influenced by Orientalists. I can't tell you how many Muslims like me, but, isn't it true that, I've heard my professor say in my course, Introduction to Islam, that all the Quran said to, the reason people followed Muhammad is that in Mecca is that Muhammad promised them virgins in heaven, and isn't it true that this is basically what the Quran did, promise them virgins in heaven, so they became Muslim and immigrated to Medina? Yeah, because our history and our story is narrated not by us, by the other. But if these poor Muslim kids understood the reality of things, it's sad because I'm not talking about the people here with me. I'm talking about the number of kids that I see them have a faith crisis because they took an introduction to Islam course, heard that, or because their evangelical friend told them this from the Islamophobic book that they were reading, and they're suddenly all discombobulated and torn apart and don't know, and it's like, oh, I have doubts and I'm full of doubts and I don't know what to do with myself, and it's really sad. It breaks my heart time again. And the response to this, which is unfortunately often translated as Allah is the fastest of plotters, which is a very unfortunate translation, because the response to this is that if you are treating ayatullah in such an unprincipled fashion, then don't forget that your fate, your entire fate, is in the hands of Allah. So, and what that precisely means is explained in the ayat, in the verses that follow, especially 23. So then in 22, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, okay, keep in mind that you are like an allegory. The allegory are those who traverse either on earth or in the sea. And when they started receiving Allah's blessings, they became jubilant and happy and content. But they forget that the very nature of Allah's sunnah in kawn is that the calmness, the blessings, turn into a tempest. And when the tempest comes, they start going back and praying to Allah sincerely, save us from this and we will be faithful. And what is the response? Well, and then when Allah then saves them, يَبْغُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ. This is 23. When Allah saves them, it is not that they commit an injustice against Allah. يَبْغُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ. What they commit, what they do, is then they commit injustices in this earth. And notice here, well, I'll come to this in a second. So, what is the response to this? يا أيها الناس إنما بغيكم على أنفسكم. People, remember that the injustice that you commit is against yourself. So, while I don't know what is this fascination with Allah is the fastest of plotters, it's not that, it will not talk about equals here. It's not that they plot and then, it's not a chess game. It is, you're talking about like, it's like saying an ant plots with, a giant. You can just step on the ant and end it all. It is the makr itself is the makr that you are committing against yourself when you live without principles or ethics, because ultimately the result of this type of Surah Yunus was once described I don't remember, I think it was Ibn Ata al-Sakandari who said Surah al-Nafs, that it is the Surah of psychology, if you would translate it in our modern language, that it is ultimately when you exist like that, a person who responds only to stimulus of reward and fear. And that's why also Ibn Arabi says Surah Yunus is أول درجة الارتقاء, that it is the beginning of elevation. That when you exist responding only to stimulus and punishment, as we said, like cattle, and we said before, then inevitably you will live in injustice, you will live in corruption, you will live in misery, and the injustice and the corruption that you cause will befall against yourself and against fellow human beings. So, again, the core thing is that it is educating these Muslims who are about to go through persecution, persecution is going to escalate, who are about to start on a journey of building a civilization. It is all about principles, commitment. So much so that I'm skipping ahead just to maybe whet your appetite, so inshallah you'll come back. Is that the way that according to Surah Yunus, the way that the Prophet Nuh deals with harm is a very difficult standard that, as a response to these poor Muslims who face crisis because of Islamophobia. Because what Surah Yunus ends up saying about Prophet Nuh alayhi salam is that he says, it is my obligation, if you're going to harm me, my iman obligates me to say, go ahead and harm me. If you're going to kill me, go ahead and kill me. If you're going to torture me, go ahead and torture me. So, those who remained Muslim after Surah Yunus had to be hardcore believers, as you will see, because we're not even close to done. What time is it now? Okay. I'm just thinking whether we should. One of the segues I just thought it's interesting because Ibn Ajiba says that among, and this is became unfortunately far more important in our day and age than even in his. He says that among the commenting on the same verses, he says that the problem is that you see the problem in a very different context, but so many of those who once dreamt of studying and learning, they say, oh, if only we can study with this teacher. So it said, وإذا أذقنا الناس حلاوة المعرفة والعلم بعد ضرر الجهل والغفرة إذا لهم مكر في آياتنا وهم أولياء المشايخ الذي فتح الله بسببهم عليهم بالطعن عليهم والانتقال عنهم كما يفعل بعض المريدين أو جل طلبة العلم بنسيان مشايخهم ونسيان العهد إليهم. That he says that students come and they say, you know, we will be we just want to learn with you or under you and so on. And once they receive the knowledge, the first thing they do is forget that the debt of gratitude that they owed their teachers. And they pretend like as if they were born with this knowledge. You know, of course, I understand what Ibn Ajiba is talking about precisely, because what is built on unethical foundations will remain unethical, even if it is knowledge. Allah will never bless an unethical enterprise. And in my view, because in modern Muslim culture, I mean, I'm not kidding, I'm not surprising anyone when I say that you talk to any person who is in any business and they'll say, oh, you know, I'd rather do business with non-Muslims than Muslims because doing business with Muslims is, you know, they betray you, they stab you. And this problem is even more in our institutions of learning than in anything. The worst students that I can count on their lack of loyalty and gratitude are often Muslim students. And that's why precisely Allah does not bless our institutions. It has what is built on ethical foundations flowers into ethical products. What is unethically founded will never be blessed by Allah. Anyway, if Ibn Ajiba goes on talking about it, but okay, so this takes us. No, I don't want to go to 26 because the husna wa ziyada doesn't want to take us. That's one of the most. Okay, so come do the honors. Close the proceedings. Grace is the official. It's not officially closed unless Grace comes and closes it.
Master of Ceremonies.
Master of Ceremonies, precisely. So come do the Master of Ceremony deal.
Okay.
We only got to 26 after all of this.
It's okay because you are laying the ethical foundations, so we'll fly the next time. Okay, well, this was absolutely amazing and riveting, and even though we only covered a very modest amount, but alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So, okay, well, officially closing the ceremony. Thank you everyone for joining us. Come back, a cliffhanger, part 2, I don't know. And inshallah, if you have any questions for this section, at least just keep them for now, and then we will, yeah, we will do inshallah Q&A next time. So on Tuesday, right? All right.
Is Surah Yunus available for adoption?
Oh my gosh, is it? Actually, I'm not sure. We'll have to double check.
It's one of the core surah in the Quran, people.